I think fundamentally you have to tell the truth. Okay, I was teasing about this article a little bit. Here's Global News, and they say Canada's current deficit level will be unsustainable within 1 to 2 years, PBO. The federal government has no more than 1 to 2 years to rein in the hundreds of billions of dollars in deficits it's racking up through coronavirus spending, or risk the debt being unsustainable. That's according to Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux, who spoke with the West Bloc's Mercedes Stephenson about the federal government's spending ahead of the throne speech on September 23rd, which Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said will pitch ambitious new programs. It's without a doubt that we can't afford deficits of over $300 billion for more than just a few years, said Giroux. And when I say just a few years, I really mean a year or two. Beyond that, it would become unsustainable. So if the government has plans for additional spending, it would clearly have to make difficult choices and either raise taxes or reduce other areas of spending, because it's clear that we cannot afford to have deficits of that magnitude for even the medium term. Okay? Okay? You heard that? You understood? We cannot run deficits of $300 billion forever. We can't even run it for 1 or 2 years, because that would become unsustainable right away. Because when you run it for 1 or 2 years, now you have to start budgeting for it every year, right? So, and that becomes unsustainable. We can't do that. We can't even afford it for the medium term, says Giroux. Back to this. Trudeau said in an interview with Global News last week that he plans to roll out an ambitious green agenda in the throne speech, which will come after he prorogued Parliament in the midst of the We Charity scandal. He said the country needs to focus on a green economic recovery to climb out from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and the worldwide economic shockwaves the virus created. I just want to point out Mr. Poilievre here says, Liberals will claim handouts to green corporations are really investments that will pay off. But if the investment paid for itself, there'd be no need for a handout. Easy rule. If a business venture needs a government handout, it's a money loser. Right. The difference between the oil fields and green economy is the green economy requires the government to be spending money, and the oil fields require access that companies pay for. We will give you X amount of money to be able to access that land, to drill that oil, to then sell it on the open market and give you a piece of that pie too, because there's so much of that pie that we don't mind giving you your piece because we still make enough money. You see how that's different? Instead of, please sir, we'd really like to make this solar farm and or wind farm and or other subsidy qualifying business, but we need X number of millions of dollars from taxpayers in order to make it viable, which doesn't mean actually make it a winning business bet, right? Like a profitable business. Make it viable just means get it up and running, right? And then maybe we'll see if it's viable. If it was viable, people would be building it. People would be building. They would say, can we build that thing right there? Because then we could serve all these houses and make all this money. They'd be building it. They'd be building it. Instead, they're looking for handouts, right, in order to build it. Okay, back to this. However, the throne speech and any new spending promises in it come as the country is bearing a load of $343 billion deficit this fiscal year, with no clear plan presented by the government on how it plans to pay it down, or when it will rein in spending. That number came from a fiscal snapshot presented by former Finance Minister Bill Morneau in July. It contains no clues as to whether Canadians can expect tax increases or service cuts down the road to pay off the cost of the deficit, though Trudeau has said that the government is not currently eyeing tax hikes. No, because why are they thinking about solving the problem? What they're thinking of doing is turning on the taps, because they've got an inexperienced finance minister who's definitely consulted people who would know, but who's got a mandate to spend more than Morneau did. So, and Morneau spent us into $343 billion of deficit, right? And $1 trillion debt, right? Okay? You understand? This is a problem. Very, very big problem. So, they're not currently eyeing tax hikes because they have no idea how they're going to solve this problem. Maybe they're just going to hand it over to the Conservatives. Let them hike the taxes. They get to sit back in opposition and say, oh, they're terrible, they're terrible, they're terrible. And as soon as we start getting things right on track again, then they'll come into power and then spend it all to hell again. Back to this. Giroux said that even if the government maintains the current deficit level, but shifts the spending around, that won't solve the problem. The amount, he said, needs to be brought under control. Quote, what's concerning is the absence of a longer-term plan, he said. That is concerning to me and to most people who are concerned about public finances. Yes, or any layman who can see the balance books and say, that's a lot more than any deficit I've ever seen in the history of Canada, period. Yeah, okay, back to this. He said it's one thing to spend to support the country during a crisis, and does not believe anyone would argue that spending was not needed. Quote, but what people are creating, What people and credit rating agencies, financial markets, and Canadians are waiting to see is what the government's plan to get out of that crisis and what are the public finances likely to look like in the next year, in the next couple of years, he said. As the crisis is evolving and we are in months 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the crisis, I think it's reasonable for Canadians to expect more from the government in terms of what's the plan going forward. Yeah, are we just going to keep lumbering around and going, oh, it's a crisis? Don't you know it's a crisis? This is unprecedented. We don't know because it's a crisis. Well, you know, the money is kind of the same, right? The money's kind of the same, and the bad governance is kind of the same, and the cronyism's kind of the same. So I don't think this excuse is good enough anymore. Right? I don't think it's viable. I don't think that it's worthwhile to believe the BS coming out of the government. And you know, maybe that'll lead to an election. Who knows? Can you imagine Trudeau being opposition leader? I think he'd probably step down. Here's some concerning censorship.